Once I had kids, for example, there was just less privacy in general, less time available to myself, to me and my partner.
Less energy.
Less energy. And that required a whole process of adaptation.
Interesting. So sort of like that machismo, men pursuing women more, or...
Yeah. It also plays out early in religion, so cultural religion.
Welcome to the Me and Us podcast, a conversation between two relationship therapists who talk about real-life issues based on what they learn in a clinical setting, working with clients, and from their own experiences of motherhood, marriage, and parenting.
Hello. Welcome to the Me and Us podcast. I am Dr. Olivia, and with me is
Elsa. Hello, everyone.
And today's topic is who wants sex more? Are couples ever on the same page when it comes to sex? So I think it's fair to say that sex, and I mean all forms of sex, not just penetration, is important in intimate relationships. Sex is good for health. It releases endorphins. It creates a feeling of closeness. It helps with sleep. And I think there are recent studies that have even shown there are cardiovascular benefits, such as preventing heart disease in men. And I've also heard it's good for the prostate in men. So I think it's an important thing in all relationships. But yeah, there's always that question, who wants it more? What do you think, Elsa?
It's very interesting. When you say who wants it more, what comes to mind are the conversations I have in my practice where people are saying, is this enough? Is this the right amount? And there seems to be a general notion that there is a right and a wrong. And I don't know that that's the case. What do you think?
I agree. And have you actually Googled or researched, because I have clients who have reported, like coming in with statistics of what is the appropriate amount of sex in relationships. And if you do, you will see things where they say, okay, from 18 to 25, most people have sex twice a week. And then after that, it goes down to once a week, from 45 to 60. And then, after that, twice a month. But I agree with you. I think it really is this sort of thing, what is enough sex? And that can really bring couples to think about, is this okay? Are we having enough sex? Are we not? And they question that. But I also think there are many couples, well, I think it's very rare for couples to be aligned in, wanting sex at the same time, for one, and the same amount of time, that couples have different...
Sorry, I think there's a delay. You were
No,
saying?
go on.
Well, I think that to answer that question, it matters if you are comparing yourself to like an outside notion of like what's acceptable and what's the norm, or what works for us as a couple, what works for me as an individual, and how do I find a common ground with my partner. So if I'm thinking, we should probably be having sex once a week, and you're not, you may feel that disappointment of like, I'm not meeting the standard, right? And your standard, or where you're comparing yourself to, may be different than the standard that your partner is comparing himself to. But when you do the work of figuring out what is the pace, or what is the quantity, or the quality really that I want, and have that conversation with your partner, what are your expectations for our sex life? And then what becomes possible when we consider the two of us, that's when I think you find your sweet spot. But for some reason, I think people want to have sex, not necessarily conversations about sex.
I was just going to say that. I think very few couples really talk about these things and talk about their own expectations or even likes and desires in the bedroom, what kind of sex, because I think sex is not just penetration. Again, sex can be all kinds of forms of intimacy and closeness, which I think sort of gets forgotten. There's foreplay and there can be afterplay. But I think that still with all of that, couples, there is what I have noticed in my practice is that many couples tend to have sort of a dynamic going where one pursues more and the other one sort of distances and has maybe lack of a desire, and the other person, really initiates and wants sex more. And that can create, I think, tension in a couple. Those differences of never really being on the same page of when you want sex.
Yes, because I think that I come back to the word responsibility. When you think of the sex you're having or not having with your partner, who is responsible for it happening or not? And what I mean by that is that I think a lot of the problems that couples encounter have to do with initiation. Like you said, oftentimes there's a person that kind of becomes responsible, the one that always wants to. And then, if it's had or not had, it depends on this person. This creates a weight for that person, a sense of responsibility. I'm the one who always has to initiate, which I find that oftentimes creates a sense of like, is my partner actually into me? It's kind of burdensome to always be the one that has to initiate.
I was just going to add, sometimes I think it does work for couples, that where maybe one person, where it works for one person to initiate more, that is sort of a dance that couples have created together that works until it doesn't work anymore, right?
Right, because then, a lot of the times, if you have somebody who is responsible for initiating, then you have somebody who's always responsible for responding. And that can feel like pressure. Do I have to always say yes to this person when they initiate? Can I allow myself to say no? And what I find is that when I work with a person that doesn't initiate as much, for them to start initiating, that creates freedom for them to be able to more freely say no if they're not in the mood when the other one initiates. In other words, when you kind of redistribute the responsibility and both people become active participants in initiating and in tune with when they want sex and they feel comfortable bringing it forward, that also brings down the anxiety and allows for both people to be more in tune with saying, not today, maybe another time.
I would say yes and no, because I have noticed that sometimes that also creates a new kind of pressure for the person who is not accustomed to initiating and doesn't feel as comfortable with initiating. And I haven't noticed it always work. I think it is a good conversation and something that is trying or at least talking about. But, I just wonder sometimes if it's natural and maybe part of biology. If you think about relationships in the beginning, the honeymoon phase, when we are not yet our true selves in relationships. And we also, have all these hormones going on that we desire sex much more. And it is much more present in the beginning of a relationship. And then it sort of declines. And I believe that it's natural and normal for couples to not want sex at the same time. And for couples to sometimes want sex at the same time, that it's sort of like this pendulum that swings and, sometimes it aligns and couples want the same thing at the same time and it just works. And other times, one person is here and the other's there and it's like this. And I think that's normal. I think that's part of, the complexity of relationships. And maybe if you put it into that perspective, and you look at it like that, maybe that alone takes the pressure off a little and just can normalize.
Right. Understand that there's a difference in timing or a difference in when a person would have the appetite for sex or not. I think it's important to understand it in the context of what's to be expected. And that does bring down the pressure. I just think what works well is when both people feel they are active participants in their sex life and not just the one that has to respond and the one that has to initiate. Because I think that over time, to some degree, that weighs on couples. That has been my experience so far. But I guess for some people it works too. I think there's a cultural aspect to that as well. I know that there's a lot of kind of labels and expectations. For me, I come from Venezuela, and it would have been negatively perceived for the women to be proposing and very in tune with her sex life.
Oh, really? So it's not custom to initiate, you're saying?
Yeah, or yes. I mean, I think there would be this idea that the man is in charge of the process more than the women would be.
Interesting. So sort of like that machismo, men pursuing women more, or
yeah,
would you
yes.
say? Yeah.
It also plays out early in religion, so cultural religion. And also, I mean, I have seen that there's this expectation that men would always want to. And I have seen men concerned when they notice that they don't want to all the time, like, am I odd for not wanting to all the time? And women concerned when their male partner wants less sex than them. So I do find that males have more pressure to have a higher libido, culturally speaking, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Women are allowed more the position of like not wanting it as much, if that makes sense. Which is not how it actually plays out in my experience clinically. I've seen many couples where the women are the one that want more frequency.
Yeah, I do too. I've seen both. I don't think there is a clear, I think it's very, and also again, back to the number of times you have sex. I think that there is no right or wrong, and it varies for every couple, right? I mean, some couples have less sex and they're very content with that. And others, need it more. But I have seen where it really does become sort of, polarized in couples where they really are not on the same page, and where one wants it much more and the other less, and they become stuck in that pattern, right? And then what do you do? What do you do as a couple when you get to that place, right? And maybe you don't talk enough about it, or you don't, right? It's very easy to sort of focus on the other and sort of blame, or, I think that's another thing, is how observant we become of the other. Because I do think a lot of couples use sex as a marker of closeness too, right? I think that's sort of like this, we haven't had sex in 2 weeks. Like, you get anxious, and it's like, oh, we need to do it, or we need to do something about it. But to me, I think underneath that, it is really sort of that connection piece again that is important. Why maybe sex or intimacy is important is bringing that closeness, right? That you still need that physical touch. But it's something that I think is very present in couples' lives and just how they observe that.
I agree. And I also think that, maybe there's an expectation to maintain a certain level. And looking at just my experience, that it's that the time available for the couple changes, especially when you have kids. So there's, like you had mentioned, the honeymoon phase, and then there's like when you get more into like habits and predictability. I think to some degree that can kind of work against the mystery that sometimes makes sex more desirable. So I think that there's a time where it maybe requires more effort than at the beginning. And I don't think people like to associate effort with sex. But then also, just what stage in life you're in. And I know that once I had kids, for example, there was just less privacy in general, less time available to myself, to me and my partner.
Less energy.
And that required a whole process of adaptation. And it's easy to get anxious about it, right? And notice and say, wow, this changed, and feel a little bit paralyzed by the process. And it takes, I think, a while for that to evolve in a positive way and work. It takes work to figure out, well, what does this look like now? Which is so different than how it all started, right?
Yeah, it's certainly, I think, a change and an adaptation when you have children. And I think everybody's sex life as new parents sort of plummets for a while. And it takes work in finding that, that sex drive again. And also, sort of that eroticism in a home where you're, breastfeeding or raising children and all of that. So that's a whole other, thing that's happening. I was just, when you were talking, I was thinking of, what do you think of planned sex? I think that becomes important sometimes, especially for some couples. I know many couples who plan, their date nights and, or have to have sex in the morning or during the day because they're too tired at night, So I think I don't think it's a bad thing at all to plan. I think a lot of people would say, oh, that's not, being spontaneous. That is, another thing to plan in my life. But I think it can be useful.
I think it can be really useful, especially when planning is synonymous with like intention and intelligence. So when my plan is about the understanding of like, when is it actually possible, and let me make this a priority, I love that, right? So like, oh, it works better in the mornings, it works better in the evenings, so therefore I will plan a time for this. I think that's really intelligent because we are very busy and it is easy for it to not become a priority. But then when planned means pressure, that's a little different. When planning is I must, I have to, I should, as opposed to like, this is something I plan for. I think it's, as opposed to like, this is something I plan to do because I want to. So I think it's like the how is the planning happening.
Right.
That makes a difference on whether it's effective or not.
I agree. So the question to you, do you believe couples want sex the same amount? Do you believe that?
In my experience, it's usually not balanced. The balance can change over time with a person who's more interested or less interested. Like it's not always, the same person who's going to want more. But no,
You think there's a biological factor?
Certainly. I know that there's research on that. For the women, it's the moment where they will have more sexual appetite. It's very related to the time they are in their menstrual cycle. So there's like biologically a time where that will peak and a time where you will have less interest. For the men, it's a little different. I think it's not as cyclical, at least in an obvious like monthly way. But it's also, I think it's also very related to what each person is going through individually in their own lives. Even, if you are extra anxious, if you are extra anxious, you may want even more or less, depending on how anxiety plays out for you. But so that's why I think it's so important, that part of like being intimate. I was thinking about the role of like conversation and knowing where your partner is at. Because what I find sometimes is that when there's this very big differential and it becomes a personal factor, like, oh, my partner doesn't want to and I want to, and you start thinking it's personal. Oftentimes what I see is a disconnect where the person is not really in tune with what's happening to their partner.
Not at all, right? They're caught up with their own self, right? More than really. And I think it's also the anxiety that drives that, right? And then it's very easy to sort of, look at your partner and say, oh, you're turning away from me, or you don't want me, or you're not interested, or whatever it is. But I think that has to do with the anxiety around it. And also I was thinking about stress. I think stress is a huge thing that can either, decrease or maybe increase sex. I think sometimes it can be sort of a way as managing your anxiety, is wanting more sex, right? I mean, you've heard of sex addiction, right? I mean, that's one form of it, but I think it is a way of managing anxiety. But at least, for me, I know I think that a woman's cycle is very critical and sort of, fluctuating your moods. But for me, stress or even feeling full, when I have a full meal, like then it's like, that's like the last thing I want. Because then I'm just not feeling sexy or attractive and I'm just tired. So, I mean, they're like those little things that I think matter.
Your body is putting a lot of energy into digestion, which would take away energy from the mental space and the physical space of everything that sex, implies. So that makes total sense. Also, if you're living in Switzerland and having a lot of that yummy food, even more,
and you have layers and layers of clothes on.
Yeah.
Well, that could be foreplay. That could be exciting foreplay, I guess.
I that creativity.
The layers.
I like that. I have a question for you. Orgasms, okay? I think what I've seen play out with clients, with friends, personally, is there's an expectation that the man should always have an orgasm, and it's visibly measurable. For the women, statistics say it's harder for women to orgasm. It's less frequent than for men. And also, it's not visibly measurable. So what happens when one person in the relationship can't orgasm? Do you think a couple can be sexually satisfied when there's an imbalance in orgasm?
Well, I mean, first of all, I think if you're speaking about women, some women can't orgasm having sex, but they can orgasm having what can I think of the word?
Masturbation?
Masturbation, or her going down on them. I think I'm speaking too much German here, that my English has just gone out the window. Yes, when your partner goes down on you, whatever the term is for that.
The medical term, the scientific term of.
Yes. So I think there, if a woman can orgasm that way, then that should be included in sex if they want that. It may take more time, but I think it could be a great way to get a woman turned on, is to go down on her, get her in the mood, and then have sex, and then both people can orgasm. I think, but I think it's true. I think there is an expectation that, at least in heterosexual couples, that men need to orgasm every time, or it's sort of like not complete, right? But women will, go without orgasm, and it will be fine. There may not even be a discussion. And I think that also speaks to maybe, I don't know what, maybe we have to demand more in the bedroom. I don't know. What do you think?
I agree. I think, looking at the two sides of the coin, I think there's a lot of pressure for men to orgasm, because, like you said, if they
absolutely
didn't, it's not complete. So that's like the downside of that.
And that can be a lot of pressure for men, because so many men struggle with that, not being able to get an erection, or having an erection but then losing it, and that can really.
I am nervous that if I don't, there will be a conversation about what is wrong with you. Then am I going to want to initiate? And if this is all playing out, this will affect how often the man wants it. I think it's easier to recur to masturbation and to disconnect from having the conversation about it. But then on the women's side, it's almost like there is no space for it, like the opposite of lack of pressure. It's like, oh, you didn't come? Okay, well, too bad. Maybe next time, right? And sometimes there's not even
have your vibrator and do it yourself. Or, I think, you have to, I think it is true. And I think it probably happens way more than we even, are talking about it. Like it's probably something that's not so spoken about. How often do you hear, women just sort of getting it done, or just, making, just clicking, checking something off as to say, okay, he's satisfied. He's not going to cheat on me if he gets sex here. So I'm just going to give in and have it. I think there's all kinds of things happening in the bedroom that are not really probably addressed, or they just become part of your sex life.
Which actually brings me, I think it relates to one of the questions I had as we think about like wrapping up and leaving listeners with a few questions to think about. One is, when there is a lack of sex, what is it reflective of? Like, so when I worry that we're not having enough sex, I'm really worried about what? Is it our connection? Is it that my partner's cheating on me? Is it that I'm comparing myself to the stories or to what the movies are showing? Or is it that I'm not comfortable with my body? So, because, again, I think that oftentimes when there is a disconnect, when somebody is not pleased with the frequency, there is an underlying story to that. And maybe it's that, like, am I feeling pressured to perform a certain way? Am I not into it because there's no room for me to have an orgasm and it takes me longer? And we can bind our anxiety on like the number of times, but in reality, I think there's often like a conversation to be had about what is really going on in the disconnect between the two people.
Yeah.
So that's something to think about. Like, when I worry about the frequency, what am I actually worried about? What's the story underneath that anxiety?
Yep. Very important question to think about. I have a question as well, and mine would be, what do you observe in yourself about how your sexual appetite fluctuates? Does your mood increase or decrease when ... question mark? For example, is it when you feel jealous or your partner seems less available to you that you are driven to be more sexual? Is it when you feel better about your body, or is it something completely else? How much does your sex drive have to do with you or with your partner? So I invite you to shift your focus onto yourself and ask yourself, what would it take for you to change your sexual appetite? And that could be to increase or decrease. That would require only a change in yourself and not in your partner. And this is a question really to get you to self-focus a little bit and look at your own role in your sex life.
I like it. So it's about observation and taking charge of what your own relationship with sex looks like.
Yeah, exactly.
Very cool. I had a second one, which is kind of like an invitation to notice as well what makes for great sex conditions. In other words, am I more likely to end up having sex with my partner if we had a big fight, if we got drunk and I was able to disconnect, if we're on vacation, if there are no kids? Because I think it's just important to understand what are the conditions that make it feasible, to then think about whether that's something that you'd like to change or improve. Mm-hmm. Just that knowing what works and what doesn't can give you choices in creating more opportunity.
Vacation would definitely be one of mine. And that's something I hear so often in my practice too, that couples who are sort of, disconnected from their day-to-day life are able to connect more sexually, when they leave the home and they go travel and they're more relaxed.
So maybe you're saying we make little time to connect with our partners in our day-to-day life. I mean, maybe that's what we're noticing, right? Like in the day-to-day life.
I think it's hard.
There's no...
It may not be possible, there's just a lot going on. And so it's more challenging, right? So the last question that I have is, if you had to engage all your senses to express your sexuality to your partner, what would you do? How would you use words using I language? So only speaking about yourself, not about something in your partner. And how would you use smell, touch, and hearing to communicate your sexual mood with your partner?
I was just thinking about the 5 senses: smell, touch, eyesight, right? Sight. Taste,
hearing. Did I miss
hearing? I think maybe taste. I don't know. I was like,
wait.
what are the 5 senses
I
again?
said smell, touch, hearing, smell, touch, hearing, taste. Oh, maybe taste. I missed. Yeah. Okay. Let's add that.
That'll be an interesting one. For me, it'll probably be somehow related to a nice glass of wine. That would be part of my story.
I think I would join you on that. A glass of champagne would do too.
Oh yeah. I like it.
But it's, you don't really think of, it's just interesting to think about what changes when you think of using all your senses and not just words to communicate, something, and then to speak an I language, to speak from your own self.
It's so funny that you said words, because I was trying to think about which sense would I most commonly relate to having sex, and I thought physical touch. It's interesting you were thinking about words.
Yeah, I know. That's interesting. Well, so lots to think about, and so many side topics we could have gone to. This is such a broad, interesting.
I was about to deviate into a conversation about porn and masturbation getting in the way of sex, and I was like, this can make for a whole new episode. We're not gonna devote just like 2 minutes.
Yep. Well,
Okay.
Thank you for listening.
And stay tuned for our next discussion. You can write to us on Instagram if there's a topic that you want to suggest that we onboard and talk about. And you can also drop some questions you may want us to address.
We would love to hear questions and feedback, and to have some more interesting things. There's so many things to talk about, but if you have something that you're interested in, please share with us.